So whether your role is technical, managerial, or sales focused, the Azure Fundamentals exam is where your certification journey begins for the Microsoft Cloud. And my mission is to give you a running start down a path that is fast, effective, and free. So you give me 30 minutes, I'm going to give you some tips and techniques and free resources that'll help you clear the AZ-900 exam quickly. So let's get started. So welcome to the session that's going to accelerate your journey to clearing the AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals exam. So my goal over the next half an hour is not just to tell you how to clear this exam, but I'm going to help you lay out a path to do it more efficiently, effectively, and free. So we'll look at some key information you need to focus on that will help anchor some information now to reduce your prep time as you go forward and improve your recall come exam day. We're going to anchor some key information and give you some techniques to anchor more as you go through Microsoft's training. And we're going to do it all for a minimum of cost, exactly free. So stick with me through the video. I'm going to share with you where to find your free training material, as well as where to find a bank of free practice exam questions written by yours truly. So let's get right into it. If you pay attention to this first tip, it has tremendous ability to help you avoid studying areas that you shouldn't be focused on for this exam, studying at a level of technical depth that's inappropriate, or studying facets of a service or concept that you're not going to be tested on. And that's by focusing on the verbs, okay? And what I mean by that is when we look at the objective domains for an exam. So I pulled these straight from the Azure Fundamentals AZ-900 skills measured document. When we look at those skills measured, we'll see verbs, often like manage, or perhaps implement, or maybe even design. But in the case of AZ-900, we see none of those. What we see is describe. So this tells us we're dealing at a less technical level here. So I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details of PowerShell or Azure Resource Manager templates or Azure CLI. I need to understand the fundamentals of the skills measured, the services and the concepts that we're dealing with. No great surprise there. Now in November, we're going to see the objective domains for this exam and the exam itself evolve in some respect. And what I noticed here was largely, and we got a look at this, a public look at this a few days ago, and we saw that the 4 objective domains became 6. And to me, it largely looked like we just had a redistribution of the same concepts. Perhaps we will get more questions in some areas than we did before and less in others. The describe element as a verb remains, so that tells us our technical level is consistent. What I did see worth mentioning here, I noticed that general security and network security bubble up to the top here in the objective domains. Quite a few of the concepts I saw under that domain look the same. I would expect with network security it looked like we may see a little more focus there in particular. And then on domain 5, identity and governance. So Azure Active Directory already showed up prominently, I would say, in the Azure Fundamentals exam, but governance, I saw some elements on the skills measured I didn't see before. So I think there are 3 aspects of Azure governance that you need to be familiar with that will give you a big leg up on this exam, and I'm going to cover those for you in a later tip in this video. And I think it will just be one of those quick items that if you remember these 3 things, it's going to give you a leg up as you prepare. Because at the end of the day, I'm here to help you prepare more quickly and more effectively. So in domain 6 there, pricing was the term used in the 4 domain version of the exam pre-November 2020. I saw cost management showed up, and really what I think this means fundamentally is not a lot. I think this is just the language being dialed in a bit, because at the end of the day, I don't believe Microsoft ever expected you to memorize pricing. They expect you to understand how you can find pricing and how you can help your customers or your organization to manage costs, avoid unexpected costs, or find cost advantages through features such as reserved instances, for example. Tip number 2. I want to talk to you about concept to word association. So if you follow this, we're going to associate a word to a concept or a feature, and if you can simply remember this word association, when you see the word in a question, it's going to give you a big indicator of what the answer will be. And you can apply this across most of the Azure services and many of the concepts, but I'm going to give you 2 prominent examples I think will be helpful to you. So the first is serverless. So if you have a question that involves the word serverless, I would bet you're going to see Logic App or Azure Functions as an answer because these are serverless. Another area, same concept, data warehouse. If you have a question on data warehouse, I would look for Data Lake, Azure Synapse Analytics, HD Insight, or Databricks. In fact, if you look at the DP-900 exam skills tested, which is the Azure Data Fundamentals, when you look at modern data warehouse, you will see these 4 services mentioned by name. So if you see a question on data warehousing, or you're just trying to remember what these services do, associate them with data warehouse, and I think you have a big leg up here. Tip number 3. So I just want to cover off comparing cloud models and services with you. And this is an area where I think you can expect a fair bit of focus. This is up in Objective Domain 1. But let's dig in here. So the services we're talking about here are infrastructure, platform, and software as a service. So the as a service offerings in the cloud, and then your cloud models, which are private, hybrid, and public. Now, all of these are going to be tied together in a discussion around the shared responsibility model, which you're expected to understand. So let's start by covering the shared responsibility model, and then we'll dig into the cloud models and services. So when you're on-prem, you are the responsible party. This is 100% yours. You own the stack. You are the customer in blue. The cloud service provider is the CSP that will show up in gray. Now, as we move into cloud with infrastructure as a service, you see the CSP, Microsoft in this case, takes ownership of some of the stack. So they're providing you the underlying networking, storage, server, and virtualization layers. You're managing your virtual machines. They're patching the applications you're running on them. When we move into platform as a service, Azure Web App, for example, or Azure SQL, you're managing data and applications, but Microsoft is providing additional functions here. So you're not worried about operating systems or runtime or a SQL Server instance. Microsoft is managing a lot of that middleware for you. And then in the world of software as a service, you're basically configuring features. You are a consumer of a service that is owned lock, stock, and barrel by Microsoft and managed by them end to end. And what you notice here is that the CSP responsibility is greater as we move to the right. So that's the shared responsibility model. So in the world of IaaS, just know that you're taking care of a little bit more than you would be in the world of PAAS, and then even less so in SaaS. So you have to think about that as an operational consideration for sure. So let's break down the cloud model. So infrastructure as a service. Microsoft provides you the building blocks: network, storage, compute, virtualization. They're staffing the data center. They're managing the hardware. They're managing the people. So really you're using the stack that they give you there. Azure Virtual Machines is where this factors. If you come from the world of Amazon, EC2 from Google, GCP Compute Engine, if you're coming to us to Azure from one of those other platforms, that's what you'd be dealing with. So let's talk about platform as a service. So in the PAAS option here, you're responsible for deployment and management of your apps. So that's, in a web app scenario or an Azure SQL scenario, you're dealing with code and data, and Microsoft is dealing with the underlying configuration, hardware, operating system, and to a fair degree, the provisioning details under the hood. So Azure SQL, API management, Azure App Service, all great examples of platform as a service in the Microsoft stack. So if you're getting value from this video, do make sure to give us a like and subscribe. You'll be notified that way every time we add a new Azure tutorial or exam prep video here. So how is serverless different from platform as a service in terms of responsibility? This is a question that's not easy for most folks to answer. I don't see it getting a lot of attention in the training materials I've seen, so I'm going to just describe it briefly here to give you some context, because I mentioned serverless and logic apps and Azure functions, right? So with platform as a service, for example, let's say you build a web app for your restaurant, and you have a menu and an ordering function there. With PAAS, I'd likely just build a web app and everything would be baked into my app. Now with serverless, I'd break that up into functions. So I wouldn't combine them all into one app. I'd break them out separately and send them separately to the provider who would handle the provisioning. So I would break my menu out into one function. I'd break ordering out into another function, for example. And my provider is going to handle scaling in that scenario. So if the menu function is used frequently, but ordering doesn't see that much traffic, the provider, Microsoft in this case, can scale each function individually. So my more popular or more frequently used menu function would get more processing power, but ordering would still have the same level of capability, and Microsoft would scale it if and where we need it. So that's fundamentally the difference. We could go down a really deep hole there, but I wanted to just call that out. So let's talk about software as a service now. So in the world of SaaS, you're really configuring features. Microsoft is giving you a service that they manage. They're responsible for management, operation, and availability of the stack. A great example there is Office 365. So in the world of third-party SaaS, you might be familiar with ServiceNow or Salesforce, just to give you a basis of comparison. Okay, so let's talk through cloud computing in terms of benefits, and then we'll get into the private, hybrid, and public cloud models here. And I'm going to use some of that word association to help you lock some terminology in your mind as we move forward through some concepts here in the next couple of tips. So benefits of cloud computing: it's global, it's secure, it's scalable, it's cost-effective. It doesn't require substantial capital expenditure outlays. It typically lowers the skills bar for us, at least when we're dealing with public cloud as an example. So let's dig into public cloud. So with public cloud, we're running everything on our provider's hardware, and we expect scale and agility are built in. Our ability to react is greater. There's a reduced need for maintenance. Our skills within our IT department can be lower, and we can still move into the cloud. We can leverage our cloud service provider's knowledge, Microsoft's knowledge and experience in this case. So with private cloud, it's really just a cloud environment in your own data center. So in terms of advantages, if you need legacy support, or you need control, or you have specific regulatory compliance needs, the private cloud is under your control. So you can manage all of these scenarios. You can accommodate all of these scenarios, where a public cloud is not going to be so straightforward in that respect, because a public cloud is always up to date and will have limited concern for legacy scenarios and may not address all of your compliance scenarios if they are less common. Now, do bear in mind that you will be tested on some of those compliance elements, and Microsoft Azure has more certifications than any other cloud provider out there. So you'll find that Microsoft can accommodate a lot of compliance, but maybe not all of them. So in a hybrid cloud scenario, this combines the public scenario and the private cloud scenario, allowing you to run your apps in the location that best suits. So the real advantage here is flexibility. If I have the need for legacy support or some odd compliance scenario, I can go to my private cloud. If I'm prioritizing on scalability and agility, I can go the public option. So hybrid just gives me the advantage of choosing where I want to go. And of course, with Microsoft, we have great capability to connect our private and public clouds in that hybrid scenario. We can use Azure AD Connect. We can use a site-to-site VPN. We can establish what we call the synchronized identity model, which is the most common identity model out there. So Microsoft Azure is a great supporter of hybrid cloud. So, what materials should I use to prepare for the AZ-900 exam? Let's have a look at the AZ-900 skills measured page. I'm going to break up what you should use to study into two parts. So the first is the proper courseware material. So if you go to the AZ-900 exam page for Azure Fundamentals, if you scroll down, you'll see where you can schedule the exam. You scroll a bit further, you see skills measured. And if we scroll down here, you can see the online free learning path. So this is the learning path for present day. So at this time, September 2020, I expect that this will change for the changes that come in November, which will only be fully known to us in November. So we saw some changes to AZ-900 that were expected in September, and they got pushed back, it appeared, so by Microsoft's message here. But what you have here in the free online learning is the ability to study material designed to prepare you for this exam, and when you have an exercise that requires a specific amount of Azure access, you'll have access to a sandbox to complete the lab exercise. So I would say for sure there's little reason to not use the material that Microsoft provides, because as you're learning the concepts and the services, you're also learning how Microsoft thinks about them and describes them. Because this is a Microsoft exam, right? So you want to make sure that your understanding is aligned with Microsoft descriptions and perspectives, and it's going to be easier for you. You could do instructor-led, and if you act quickly, you may even find one of the free Azure Fundamental Training Days left. So in North America, those seem to be gone, and they were gone in most countries last I checked. Do stick around to the end of the video, though, because I do have one more free surprise to help you get prepped for AZ-900. So cloud concepts. So there are some concepts that you're expected to be familiar with, and I want to call them out here and again associate some terms to some concepts to help you lock these into your mind more quickly as you're preparing for AZ-900. So scalability is one that comes up, and scalability generally refers to growth, the ability of a system to handle growth, if that's users or work. Elasticity may come up. So when a system is elastic, it can grow and shrink based on our app demand. So on premises, we typically have to provision for our spike, right, for our peak. So when we provision a SharePoint farm on-prem, our servers on the front end are sized for our peak. That sort of thing is not necessary in the cloud by and large, because the cloud is elastic, and services that we provision can generally grow and shrink based on app demand. And that's particularly true when we look in the PAAS space. Agility. So this is the ability to react quickly to changes in demand. So provisioning additional capacity quickly without manual intervention. And the cloud also enables agility in terms of going to market. So as environment or market conditions change, the cloud makes us more agile, generally speaking, because we can respond to those changes more quickly, than if we had to order additional server infrastructure, go get the budget approval for that, spin up a big project for all that deployment. Economies of scale. Bottom line, when you're working with a cloud provider like Microsoft, they have lower per unit costs than you could achieve on your own, because they are operating at a larger scale, at a global scale. So they are achieving what we call an economy of scale. Capital expenditure, you're generally going to hear this simply called CapEx, and this is spending of money on physical infrastructure up front. So when you're buying servers, that's an example of CapEx. When you're buying infrastructure for your private cloud. Operational expenditure, typically just called OpEx, is spending money on services or products now and being billed as you go. So that's really where the cloud comes in. So the cloud means we're trading CapEx for OpEx typically. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily spending less money in all cases. It simply means that the nature of our spending is different. We're trading CapEx for OpEx when we move to cloud. And a consumption-based model, that's simply paying for what we use. When we pay for a virtual machine, we're paying for increments of time as we run that virtual machine. When we work with Azure Functions, with Logic apps, we may be paying by execution. When we're working with different flavors of Azure storage, we might be paying by gigabyte and paying a different price depending on how long we retain that data. So pay for what you use, typically based on per unit of time or capacity. So minutes, gigabytes, executions, etc., including but not limited to those models. So for tip number 5, I've broken some concepts out separately because they all fall into that area of high availability and disaster recovery. So I want to help you kind of sort these out in terms of their scope. So the first term is fault tolerance. So this is the ability of a system to handle faults, like a power failure, a network failure, a hardware failure. Typically, when you're dealing with fault tolerance, you're talking about component level failures. So that's the scope we're typically dealing with. When it comes to high availability, that's the ability of a system to keep services up and running for long periods of time. So when we're thinking about high availability, we're often talking about service level failures. Often we're talking about within a single data center. We're not talking about site failure, but we could be. We're talking about service level failures, though, when we think about it in the cloud context. And then disaster recovery is our ability to recover from an event which has taken down a cloud service. So that could be any number of things, like a data center failure, which in the case of Azure would be exceedingly rare. In the case of virtual machines, we can use Azure Site Recovery to replicate those VMs and bring them up quickly in the event that we lose those VMs for any reason. And if we had a service fail in a particular region, say Azure SQL failed in a particular region, if we're replicating that database, we can bring it up in another region. So disaster recovery comes in many, many shapes and sizes and forms in the cloud. But because the cloud is global, we don't have to worry about spinning up multiple remote data centers to make sure that our service is always available in the event we have a localized outage at a data center, for example. In a traditional sense, in on-premises compute, in private cloud, we always would think of disaster recovery as recovery in the event of a site failure, but really in the cloud context, this is a service failure or a site failure. It's not exclusively a site event. Okay, and I mentioned if it doesn't come on the exam here pre-November 2020, I believe that November and beyond, you'll see potentially some new questions around Azure governance. So I want to cover three features here that will be of interest to you. So Azure policy includes policy definitions, which are the definition of a condition that we want to control or govern. So for example, if we wanted to control naming conventions, or we wanted to make sure that when someone deployed a virtual machine in a development environment, they didn't deploy a very large virtual machine, we could establish policy definitions to enforce our desire in that case. An initiative in the world of Azure governance is a collection of Azure policy definitions that are grouped together to achieve a specific goal. So that scenario I just described, if I needed to ensure that my virtual machines followed a specific naming convention, I needed to ensure they were of a specific size, they were deployed to a specific region, they were coupled with other specific monitoring and management services, I might create an initiative to interlace all of those elements into a grouping so I can achieve that specific goal a little more cohesively. But bottom line, think of an Azure initiative as a collection of Azure policy definitions. And then the third item that I think is worth memorizing is Azure Blueprint. So a blueprint, think of it as a container or a folder for composing sets of standards, patterns, and requirements for implementing cloud services, securing your cloud services, and designing. So frequently when I see Azure Blueprint, I'm going to see it mentioned in the context of new environments. So if you had a question around Azure governance and new environments, I would bet you that it's going to be a question related to Blueprint. And Azure Blueprints can include a number of different types of artifacts. To the degree you need to be aware of those, that should be covered in the free training from Microsoft Online. Okay, and I promised you that there was going to be at least one free element that I would contribute to your preparation for AZ-900, and here it is. So to help assess your readiness, I'm going to tell you how you can get time-limited free access to practice questions for the AZ-900 exam. So I've actually created a bank of AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals exam preparation questions for you. So just practice tests effectively. And if you go to learning.starweaver.com and if you search for AZ-900 here, you will find those questions. And at Starweaver, you can basically sign up for a 5-day free trial and have access to those questions. Generally speaking, I think anybody preparing for AZ-900 is going to be done in a week or less. So this should give you enough time to get through this entirely for free using Microsoft's free online training and what you can get from me with the help of Starweaver for those free practice exams. If this video hit the spot, be sure to like and subscribe because there's more where that came from. Thanks for watching. Good luck on the exam. Take care.